Good evening, and thank you all for being here. My name is Mark Freed, and I'm a past board president and longtime board member of the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida. For more than 70 years, Jewish communities around the world have gathered, just like we are this evening, to celebrate Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. This day is set aside to honor the victims of the Holocaust, to recognize the survivors and refugees, and to pay tribute to the heroes, the righteous, the few who had the courage to stand up and do right. It is a time of reflection. For me, it is a time to reflect on my own life, the courage of the generations who came before me, what it means to be Jewish in America, to raise Jewish children, and to ensure that one day their children will be as proud of their Jewish heritage as I am of mine. I reflect on how I learned about the Holocaust as a young boy in Sunday school and Hebrew school, where I remember Rabbi Levy in his accented baritone first introducing me to words like Auschwitz and Dachau and Kindertransport, but sought to temper those nightmare-inducing stories with tales of the righteous, the liberators, and the survivors. I had nightmares anyway. I reflect on how in 1994, my then girlfriend and now wife introduced me to her kind and gentle boss, Henry Landworth. Was I more awed by his literally unbelievable story of sadness and survival, or the way he loved Steph like a daughter? It's impossible to say. He quickly went from a man I admired to a man I wanted to model my life after, if even in small ways. In addition to our 3 wonderful children, I will forever be grateful to Steph for bringing Henry into my life too. I also reflect on becoming a part of this amazing organization. It is not an understatement to say that joining this board and meeting Tess Wise and Helen Greenspun and other survivors changed my life and how I live forever. But on this day, Holocaust Remembrance Day, a day of reflection, I reflect on other things too. I reflect on that moment in junior high school when a boy I had known since kindergarten drew a swastika in my yearbook. He said it was a joke, but it felt like a punch to the gut. And when kids I considered my friends stood by and watched and laughed, it felt like being punched again. I reflect on that moment in college while attending a lecture on the Holocaust, how the guy sitting 2 chairs down from me, forgettable until that moment, stood and exclaimed, "None of this is true. It didn't happen." And my pulse raced and my blood boiled, because until that moment, I thought Holocaust deniers were fictional characters. How do such people exist? And then I reflect on that moment just a few months ago when my youngest son called to tell me that a swastika had been painted on the walls of the bathroom at his high school in our supposedly progressive community. And I realized that in all these years, sadly, nothing has changed. On Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, we need to remember that reflection is good, but learning must be our goal. After all, that is why Tess Wise intentionally and brilliantly crafted a mission statement for this center that explicitly says that we must not only remember the Holocaust, we must also use the lessons of the Holocaust to create a more just society, free of anti-Semitism, prejudice, and bigotry in all forms. So while we gather today in reflection, in remembrance, in honoring the victims of the Holocaust and recognizing the survivors and the righteous, let us also take that next step and use what we learn, harness what we feel, act on what we know, and do our part to speak out against anti-Semitism and thwart the barrage of hate that sadly, unfortunately, remains so prevalent in our society today. Rabbi Kay.
I'm Rabbi David Kay. I am here as the chair of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida and as a longtime member of the Central Florida and Greater Orlando Jewish community. This is Yom HaShoah. The original given name, the full name of this day is Yom Zikaron LaShoah VeLaGvura, Day of Remembrance of the Holocaust and of the heroism. The date was deliberately chosen as the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, reminding us of the dozens and dozens of acts of resistance and revolt, not only in the Jewish community, but among the non-Jewish community throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. So we recall both those who were lost and those who resisted. Heroism takes many forms, and any form you could think of was displayed by people during that terrible time. We're going to light 6 candles, each representing 1 million Jews who perished in the Shoah. Also down in front, next to the candles, you see a stand with a very thick book on it. That book has a very simple text. Each page has the word Jew written many, many times. In that small type, with that many repetitions, we needed this large of a book to simply write the word Jew 6 million times. I'm going to invite those who have been honored with lighting candles to please come one at a time, light one of the 6 candles for us. I invite you to turn with me to page 5 in the program as we rise for the traditional memorial prayer, El Malei Rachamim. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hametzei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Ashchina, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. ונשמות יקרנו קדושינו, שהלכו לעולמם. אמנה, בעל הרחמים, אז תירם בצל כנפיך לעולמים. וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם, אדוני ונחלתם, וינוחו ושלום על משכבם, ונאמר אמן. God, filled with mercy, dwelling in the heavens' heights, bring proper rest beneath the wings of your Shekhinah, amid the ranks of the holy and the pure, illuminating like the brilliance of the skies, the souls of our beloved and our blameless, who went to their eternal place of rest. May you, who are the source of mercy, shelter them beneath your wings eternally, and bind their souls among the living, that they may rest in peace. Let us say together, Amen. We turn to the next page. Please remain standing for Qadhish Yatom, for the Mourner's Qadhish. Those who would like to recite along with me in the original Aramaic, please do so. The text is at the top of the page and in phonetic transliteration, the left-hand side of the bottom of the page. Yitkadal v'yitkadash me'raba bi'alma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi shmei rabba mivarach le'alam lamei amaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shmei dekudsha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiran bi'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shmaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. You may be seated. It is a custom to recite Mourner's Qadhish on the anniversary of the passing of dear ones. Because of the large number of those who perished in the Holocaust, every day of the year is a yahrzeit, is the anniversary of the passing of one of the victims of the Holocaust. And so it is appropriate to recite the Mourner's Qadhish not only today, but every day. If you turn to page 7, I'd like you to join me in responsive English reading. Reading is entitled, No Religion is an Island. This reflects the title and the subject of a brief essay written by Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel in response to Nostra Aetate in 1965, the Catholic Church's statement altering the status quo of the relationship between the Catholic Church and other religions, particularly Judaism. So please read the bolded lines after me. No religion is an island. There is no monopoly on holiness. No religion is an island. We share the kinship of humanity, the capacity for compassion. Your spirit rests upon all, Jew or Gentile, man or woman, in consonance with their deeds. There is no monopoly on holiness. There is no truth without humility. You are near to all who call upon you in truth. There can be disagreement without disrespect. Should we hope for each other's failure, or should we pray for each other's welfare? Have we not all one parent? Are we not all your children? Your hand is extended to all those who see you. Let our deeds reflect what we share in your image.
Thank you, Rabbi Kay. And now we'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Anna Salton Eisen was a founding member and the first president of Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas. In January at this congregation, her rabbi and friends were taken hostage in an anti-Semitic attack that received international attention. She has conducted extensive research into the Holocaust and spoken on that topic to school and community groups. She served as a docent for the Dallas Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies, now the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and conducted Holocaust survivor interviews for the USC Shoah Foundation. Anna was an adult when she finally broke her parents' silence about their Holocaust experience. In her book, Pillar of Salt, she combines the meticulous work of a scholar with the compassion of a daughter, courageously embracing her legacy as a second-generation survivor. This memoir completes the story told in the 23rd Psalm, a Holocaust memoir, which Salton Eisen wrote with her father about his experience and will be reissued this fall in a 20th anniversary edition. She is also producing a documentary named In My Father's Words, based on her 2 Holocaust memoirs with the filmmaker Jacob Weiss, who is the great-nephew of Tess Wise, the founder of the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida. Please welcome to the stage Anna Salton Eisen.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight and allowing me to share my family story and my father's story, and may the memories of all those who perished be a blessing to us all. So my name is Anna Salton Eisen, and I'm a child of Holocaust survivors. Okay. There we go. So like many children of survivors, I was raised in a home where the Holocaust wasn't talked about. This could have been for many reasons. One, I think my parents were trying to protect us. 2, there was a lot of encouragement for them to move forward and make peace with the past. And 3rd, I just think that possibly some things they had experienced and witnessed were simply unspeakable. I was born in Rome, New York, but when we were 5, I was 5, we moved to the Maryland suburbs when my father got a job at the Pentagon. And when I was about 7, I started to realize some things were different. My father had no relatives. He didn't talk about his childhood. My parents spoke with heavy accents, and there were no photographs of anyone in the house. I had heard a few words. I had heard boxcar, war, camps, and also, like children, I picked up on the subtlety that there were some things which were not okay to talk about. But when I was about 8 years old, I remember going into one of the sitting rooms and looking for a deck of playing cards and reaching my hand deep into a side table drawer where I pulled out 2 watercolor paintings. They were so vibrant and horrific and frightening for me as a young child. I really had no context to understand these. They hadn't been in any storybooks or school books, but clearly, I could see that there were some kind of soldiers and that there was great brutality going on in this painting. It was signed, as seen on the right, by an L. Zaltzman. I had no idea who that was. And on the left side, it said Neustadt and was dated 1946. The second painting that I found when I was just a child was of a young man kneeling in front of a pit where obviously there were bloodied bodies and people standing about with guns. This was very upsetting to me, but I put them away and kept the silence. I never told my parents that I had found them, and indeed, I didn't ask. I got to see over time that when something came up about the war or about the camps or where were the grandparents, why did we have no family, my father might look anguished or upset, and so it became our job to just not bring it up and just be good and happy children. But I wanted to know more, and over time, I started doing my own secret search. I would go to the library back when we had the card catalog, and I looked up World War II and war, and indeed I found a book that had a picture of a big pile of bodies in black and white being bulldozed. And I wondered, is this the secret? Is this what happened? Are these my family? And over time, I kept searching. I was recently in a library where I gave a talk and admitted that I even took a library book without telling anyone, because I thought, this is not something we're supposed to know about or read about, and it was a story of a young woman who had survived the Holocaust. And over time, I started reading more and studying more, but still keeping it all a secret. Eventually, and this is my father, my beloved father, in 1984, I moved to Dallas with my soon-to-be husband, where they had one of the first Holocaust museums in the United States, and indeed, the very first boxcar. And I remember walking down the steps. It was in the basement of the JCC, and at the time, you could either go in a door, which was shut, or you had to walk directly through the boxcar. And I can still remember standing in there, in this dark space with no seats, no windows, no air, and just running my hands on the scratched wood and knowing that this indeed had been the same kind of space that my grandparents had been in, that other Jews had been in, and it was just a very emotional and difficult moment. But everything was there for me to learn. And soon enough, I became a docent, and I was taking groups, and I was telling the story that I had never been taught. What happened in 1933, the boycott of businesses, the burning of books, the Nuremberg laws of 1935, Kristallnacht in 1938, the voyage of St. Louis in 1939, and what happened with the ghettos, with the mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, the camps, and liberation. And this became a way for me to really try and learn and master the story and the emotions that I was just keeping to myself. But at that point, I started doing the Spielberg interviews, and I remember I did one with a man who was just so incredible. I mean, a lot of the survivors, it was the first time they had talked about it. It was very emotional. It was emotional for me. But I realized during one interview that I wanted to be the one to be with my father when he told his story. I didn't want him weeping with a stranger, and I didn't want to see it on a tape. So I went and I confronted him and told him that I wanted to know what he had been through. And my father, a loving, generous, wonderful man, began to share and tell me his story. I asked him, do you think we can go to Poland? And sure enough, 2 weeks later, the whole family was on a plane going to Poland. My father would be our guide. We started out going to all the major places and learning about the history of what happened. We went to Warsaw, we saw where there had been the ghetto, we went to Krakow. I stood in abandoned synagogues and desolate cemeteries all across Poland. We went to Auschwitz and Birkenau, and then, as my father said, we went deeper into the den of the beast. We traveled east to Rzeszów, where he had been in the ghetto, to Tichin, to his town, and even into his home, to Tomaszów-Lubelski, the home of my mother, and to Belzhic, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were exterminated, mostly from this region. Here is a photograph from our trip that day. On the far left is a picture of my father standing in front of his grade school. In the middle, we went to visit the home of his friends, Rushkevitz. They were not Jews, but they helped him. They helped him find some work. They helped him with food. And on the right is the picture of us in his home. As we approached that day, he said, no matter what, I'm not going in. But before you know it, the door was open, and there we were. And I walked up the staircase that was worn smooth from years, and I knew that this had been my grandparents' home. I went and stood in my grandmother's kitchen, and for the first time, I felt her presence. My brother and I had plotted to somehow find the attic, and we did. And I'd always fantasized I would find something, a prayer shawl, a book, some photos, but there was nothing to be found. But I took solace in the fact that we had returned. And I began to learn about my father. He was Lucien Zaltzman. He was the artist that painted those paintings. Here in a photograph that had been sent out to relatives is my grandmother Anna, that I'm named for, my grandfather Herman, who was an attorney, my father on the right, the little baby of several months old. This was probably taken the year he was born in 1928, and his older brother Monik, who was 6 years older than him. My father returned to drawing in 2008. His book had come out, and it was another way for him to express what he had seen, what he had witnessed, and these photographs are now, these drawings I mean, part of the collection at Yad Vashem. So here he just shares with us what he remembers of his town Tichin. You see there are religious people, children playing in the street. It was just for him a wonderful childhood. He learned to skate on the pond, he played with friends, they would go visit relatives in Vienna and in Krakow. But in 1939, in September, the Germans came and occupied Tichin, and very quickly things changed. All of the restrictions from the Nuremberg laws in Germany were soon instituted. Jewish children were not allowed to attend school, his father was not allowed to work, they weren't allowed to have jewelry and money, and soon there was even great brutality, as he drew here, where people were forced to wear the armbands and sometimes get on their hands and knees and scrub the street. After a difficult period of occupation, the Jews of Tichin, like in many other communities, were ordered to meet in the town square with a few belongings, and they were marched, although there were a few wagons, to the nearby city of Rzeszów, where they had established a ghetto. In that small part of town were some 23,000 Jews. There was great hunger and deprivation and sickness and brutality. In the ghetto, as my father drew here, at one point, Daimler-Benz had come in and opened a munitions factory, and they had a quota and not enough Polish workers. So there was an agreement there would be allowed some Jews to work. One day, my father and his brother and a group of young men were outside the labor office, and my father's brother saw one of his old high school shop teachers who was collecting ID papers, and he called out, "Monik, give me your paper." And he had always been a kind teacher, so my father's brother not only threw his paper in the box, but also my father's. Not long after, the approximately 500 young Jewish men who had their papers marked were separated into another part of the ghetto, and the rest of the Jews in the first week of July 1942 were put on boxcars to be sent to abandoned farms where there would be food and places to live. But instead, they were just sent a few miles, and within a few hours, they were all stripped and gassed and murdered at Belzhytz. Here is a poster of the 465 Daimler-Benz Jews, and you can see it says, "We serve the nation," with a swastika, and there are people at the bottom laboring, and you can see at the far right, that's actually what they worked on, is the munitions for small aircraft. My father was part of this group. Sometimes there would be 300, sometimes 600, but at the very end, the SS took over the factory and said no more Jews can work here, and there were 465 Jews that were deported from the Reichshof factory that was built at Rzeszów. Here was the Reichshof because they Germanized the names of the town, and this is a picture of the actual factory they worked at. The Nazis built a barracks there, and it soon became a concentration camp. From there, my father and the group went to Płaszów. This is the camp made famous in the movie Schindler's List. Here, the camp that was built on two former Jewish cemeteries, my father and the others had to dig up the graves with their bare hands. After being at Płaszów for a few months, they were sent to work in this place, Wieliczka. This is outside of Krakow. It is the salt mines. From Wieliczka, he went to Flossenburg, which just 2 days ago was the anniversary of the day it was liberated. In Flossenburg, my father worked in the stone quarry. This is where he had the small packet of photographs and notes and information that he had kept with him taken away, for they were stripped naked and forced to be outside in quarantine in all conditions for a period of 2 weeks. After leaving Flossenburg, they were sent through Colmar in France to a tunnel that you see here on the left in a place called Orbis. This was an abandoned tunnel that had been constructed but in the 1930s. And the Germans came and put the factory equipment into this tunnel. As you can see on the right, there's an inscription painted on the wall by some Jewish prisoners that says, "Here worked 462 Jews from Poland." 3 Jews died during that time. But the Allies were coming and they had to dismantle and leave the factory. So again, they were moved, this time to Sachsenhausen. All the camps, this is back in Germany, had the same terrible conditions. The striped uniforms, meager rations, selections, roll calls, people dying every day from sickness, from hunger, and just from cruelty. At Sachsenhausen, the group would be split. Some would go to Bremen, and some would go to Braunschweig. They first stopped in Wattenstadt, and it was at this place that my father and another prisoner changed uniforms to change identities. Some of the people here wanted to stay with friends or people they knew that spoke the same language because they were from different countries. So from Wattenstadt, my father changed his name with his uniform to Joseph Singer. And it was a name that he would remember all the days of his life. So then he was at this camp in Braunschweig, again doing labor, and they didn't know what their future would be because the factory had been bombed and they no longer had any purpose as a slave labor group. From Braunschweig, they went to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was primarily a women's camp, but had a small sub-camp for men. This was a very famous thing happened here. A delegation came from Sweden and tried to negotiate the release of some of the prisoners. That didn't happen, but at this camp, which is one of the only times, if not the only time in the Holocaust, the prisoners were allowed to get some Red Cross rations. And my father writes about in his memoir how they walked by a warehouse as they were being marched again to a boxcar and were allowed to get a box. And of course, my father talks about how he was so weak he couldn't carry most of the canned goods, but he managed to get some powdered milk, some cheese, some crackers, some chocolate, some cigarettes, and those helped him stay alive. From Ravensbrück, he was sent to Webelin. Webelin was a camp that was only operated for 10 weeks. It wasn't even finished yet. The barracks had no doors, no bunks, no windows. The prisoners slept on the dirt floor. And in a period of 10 weeks, 1,000 prisoners died. This is my father, second from the right, taken on the day of liberation, May 2nd, 1945. They were liberated by the 504th PIR of the 82nd Airborne. And he'll tell you about it.
Really, I didn't know what was happening in the war. We knew a little bit about, I tell in the book, there were some landings in Normandy and the Russians were advancing, but what exactly was happening, we didn't know. I was in one of those terrible camps where most of the people were not Jewish, but there were Jewish people there too. A terrible camp where they no longer buried the dead, and the still living were kind of commingled with the unburied dead laying around in big piles. When physically I was exhausted and my hips hurt for some reason, I couldn't walk. My teeth were broken because I never had any fresh fruit for a period of years. And then, my hope was gone. I prayed to my God to take my soul to my parents. And then, it's a great unexpected surprise. It was a great unexpected surprise. Miracles happened. 9 or 10 American soldiers came into the camp. They cut the wires, round helmets, olive green uniforms, guns, radios came to the camp. The German guards, there must have been 50 or 60, disappeared, and we were liberated. It was a day of glory for all of us. I remember people dancing and screaming, half dead people dancing and screaming. I remember me crawling up there to touch the soldiers' shoes to make sure that they were real. Because I had lived under the boot of the angel of death for such a large part of my life. And now I saw angels of life.
He was liberated by the Americans, but he was in a displaced persons camp that was part of the British zone in Neustadt, the place where he painted that first painting. On the left here, you see the document he got in lieu of a passport. And finally, after 2 years of handing letters to American soldiers to an uncle he had with no address in New York, he got a paper saying that he was going to go to the United States from Bremen on the USS Marine Flasher. And this on the right is the original telegram that he received saying, please advise the above that you would be coming to New York to be with your family. And here is his papers from being on the ship, a photograph of him on the ship, and still an artist. You know, he was in the camps from age 14 to 17. So here he was only 19 years old and still, you know, drawing a little picture. There's the ship that he's going on, the SS Marine Flasher. He came to the United States. He had a 5th grade education, but he was drafted as a permanent resident. He served in the U.S. Army, met and married my mother, who was also a survivor, the love of his life, and had 3 children. He used the GI Bill to go from 5th grade to college, where he received a bachelor's in physics and a master's in engineering before he went on to have a career at the Pentagon. And then he started telling his story after our trip to Poland, and in 2002, we published his book. This is the new edition that's going to be coming out in September. And this is just a drawing that I had found that is a self-portrait of him. How do I know it's a self-portrait? Because in this and many of the drawings, it has his prisoner number from the Flossenburg camp. There was a lot of amazing connections that happened when the book came out. He thought it was just his story and nobody would be interested. But we told him that his story had the stories of others in it. Living right near me in Colleyville, Texas, I read about Lieutenant Colonel James McGillis. We called him Maggie, or everyone did. He was the most highly decorated veteran of the 82nd Airborne, and he was one of the handful of soldiers who liberated my father. They became friends and actually traveled to the Veblen camp as a guest of the German government to lay a wreath in the memorial on one of the anniversaries. And you can see them here. They both wrote books, and they traveled through Europe together with my mother and McGillis's wife. When my father's book was being published from the University of Wisconsin Press, that photograph of him he had found in this book on the left, The Devil in Baggy Pants, The Combat History of the 82nd, in the War Library at the Pentagon. And in order to have permission to have it reprinted, we sent it to them. And the permissions editor, Margaret Walsh, looked through the book and discovered her father's picture in it, Staff Sergeant William Walsh, and he had been one of the handful of soldiers who liberated my father. So we went with CNN and had a reunion, and one of the sons in the parking lot had the Nazi flag in the trunk of his car that had been flying over the Veblen camp that his father had cut down. In 2016, my father passed away, but he had spent many, many years doing important and meaningful work of teaching about the Holocaust, of speaking and doing testimony. But I still wanted to know more. I think I've been that way my whole life. So I started researching through the Arlsen Nazi archives in Germany. And as you can see on the left, I put in his name, and there were many, many spellings. I don't think anyone asked him, how do you spell your name when you arrived at a camp? And here on the right, you see Lucian Zaltzman, born January 7th, 1928, from Przemyśl, which is a town now where the Americans are and the media, as well as Rzeszów during this crisis in Ukraine. And this is on the Ravensbrück list. I found his name again on this list written from the Flossenburg concentration camp. I started delving into the records because it made it all more real, and it helped preserve the truth and the history, which is so important during this time of Holocaust denial. This remarkable list with his beautiful calligraphy was from the Natzweiler camp. This is where he was in France. And you can see his name there again, just so beautifully written, which is just, to me, unbelievable. They had post-war cards like this that listed all 10 camps with his different prisoner numbers. Again, putting together the history. And some items I discovered like this. This is the bread list from the Veblen camp. It's dated the end of April, April 28th, 29th, 30th. It goes to May 1st. But then on May 2nd, there was no bread, because this was the day the Americans arrived. This was a miraculous day, and during my research, I discovered for more reasons than just that he was liberated by the Americans. On May 1st, my father and the other prisoners in Veblen were loaded into boxcars that didn't leave for uncertain reasons. They sat all night, and on the morning of May 2nd, they were taken out, as my father said, while the guards fled, and the trains were supposed to be headed to Lübeck Bay. Did they not go? Some say because the tracks were blown up, some say because a locomotive didn't arrive, but that's where the prisoners of Veblen, which was a sub-camp of Neuengamme, and all the prisoners from all the Neuengamme sub-camps were headed to Lübeck Bay, where they would have been loaded onto 2 ships that were mistakenly fired upon by the British. More than 6,000 prisoners died there on May 3rd by drowning, on fire, or shot on the beach. So all those prisoners with my father had another miracle that somehow that train didn't leave and that they were saved. When COVID began, I moved my mother, who lives with me now, who's a 100-year-old Holocaust survivor, from Florida. And when we sold her house, in the belongings, I found this collection of photographs. These were other photographs of people in the DP camps, along with a small notebook and diary and his prison pass. Now, in his memoir, and when we went to Poland, he had told stories about these friends, about the other prisoners, about Yitzhak Vox, about Leon Horn, about Moses Tuchman, about Moses Hofstetter, about Moses Zimmant, all of these people. And when I turned over the picture on the far left, it was indeed a picture of Moses Zimmant. Itzik Rip, next to him, Moses Hofstetter, Tobias Newson, and all of a sudden, these people were flesh and blood, and they were more real to me. So I decided that I was going to go and start looking for them and their families. In the Arlson archive, I found this document. It says 465 prisoners, Jews, from Rzeszów, transported to Colmar in France in August 1944. I found my father's name on this list. I found confirmation that there were 465, and I started tracking down the other prisoners. Back on the Ravensbrück list, highlighted in yellow, I found some of the people that he had talked about. And this was critical because it gave me their date of birth, spelling of their name, and the town that they were from. I found Moses Tuchman. He had this Flossenburg card on the left, like all the prisoners in the group had, and on the right, his post-registration card from after the war. He had been in all the same camps. He had the birth date, and it said on the bottom right that he was going to go and find his Uncle Herman, who lived in New York, who actually had a fish market. I found the papers of Tobias Newson, who was also from Radom, another town in Poland, who had been in Flossenburg, and it had all of his information. So slowly I started to put together a file of these people. I found this boy, Itzik Rip. He was born in the same town as my father, in Przemyśl, and he was also 14 when he went into the camps. He was my father's age. This picture was taken when he was 17 years old, after 3 years in 10 camps. But unfortunately, in my searches, I also found his death records. In 1947, at age 19, he died of unknown reasons, being transported in an ambulance on the way to Hamburg. Some people have no one to remember them. So I went and I found them all. And we met in New Jersey. Lucien Zaltzman's my father, Yitzhak Fox, the daughter Zoom from Texas, Emma Ringel's daughter lives in New York, Tobias Newson's daughter lives in New Jersey, Leon Horn's son lives in New Jersey, Moses Zimmer's daughter lives in Sweden, Moses Tuchman's daughter lives in New Jersey, and Motek Hofstadter's daughters live in Israel. And we got together in a hotel room, and we had a reunion, a meeting, a great connection. But the story doesn't end there. I wrote my memoir and started working on the documentary film. As you can see, the back of, I don't have a better picture because he's the filmmaker, interviewing my son. And the picture on top is one of my favorites. My son is co-writer of the book. He is one of the writers on the film. And when I first wrote the manuscript, A Pillar of Salt, my father got sick soon after, and I just put it away. I decided I wasn't going to publish it. I literally destroyed every copy I have, every digital copy. There was one paper copy my son found by accident, and he read it and he said, you know, we have to publish this. So he helped me rewrite it and get it published just like I had helped my father write his story. And the picture on the top I love. It's my father and son walking in step. And I know that he is having that conversation with my son that my father could never have with me, in a gentle and loving way, passing on the legacy and telling the story. And here's just a look at the teaser for the film.
Early in the last century, a government of a large and civilized country in Central Europe has decided that the segment of its population was less than human.
I remember just rummaging through one of the end tables looking for some playing cards, and I came across 2 old watercolor paintings of horrific scenes that I could not have even imagined. And they were signed by someone named L. Zaltzman.
And consequently, they could be denied access to education, that could be denied opportunity to work, they could be arrested, they could be beaten.
He wanted a family that replaced the family he lost. And he wanted that feeling of security.
I just really felt the need. I felt compelled to try and find out who my father really was. You know, who was this Lucien Zaltzman?
Who was my father? My father was Lucien Zaltzman. And I think I can see the resemblance here between his photograph when he was 17 and the painting he painted at the very same time. And I'll introduce my mother. This was just taken in January 21st of this year, the day before her 100th birthday. It was the first Friday night Shabbat service after the hostage situation, and she insisted that she was going to go to the service. And she stood with my rabbi, who said to her, Ruth, tonight is a night of survivors. During the war, her family fled Tomaszów-Lubelski and went to Siberia. But after the war, she returned to Poland, to Chechen, where there was a kibbutz, and many set up by groups who had come from Israel. And in the kibbutz, she was approached and asked to join the bricha, which means escape. And they were helping the survivors flee from Poland to Germany, from Italy, from Czechoslovakia, to cross the borders illegally, to go through the mountains, to go through the woods in order to get on illegal ships and get to Israel. She also had the mission and the work of going and looking for children who had been left, hidden in convents or with families. And here is a picture from the U.S. Holocaust Museum of her outside the woods with all these children that she found, and that's her on the left wearing a cape. On the left is a synagogue that I stood in Lublin. It was empty, it was desolate, And I thought, this is not what it's supposed to be. This place should be full of life and joy and a community. And after the incident at my synagogue, about 4 days later, I was allowed in to return. I was in charge of the renovation because the building was so badly damaged. And I just remember standing in there, and it was so quiet and so barren, and it just reminded me of what it felt like to be in Poland. But here on the right, we were able to come back and bring the Torahs back. And as I say, we are not defeated, and we will not live in fear. Thank you for letting me share my story. I think we're going to, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy. I think that Paula has a microphone, so if you just want to raise your hand, if you have a question, I'm happy to do my best. If you raise your hand. There's a couple that went up and down and up.
Thank you so much. That was just so inspiring and so beautiful. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more about your mother? I mean, you just kind of touched it, but she seems as amazing as your father. So just a little bit more would be wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, she is amazing, but she was always kind of in the background and never telling her story. And it's, made me realize, how unusual it is that I grew up in a house that I didn't know my parents' name. I have her false papers. Her name was not Ruth Wolfberg. And when I was growing up, people would say, "Where are you from?" And she'd say, "I'm from Berlin." And I was like, why is my mother lying? She's from Poland. But then when I found her false papers, it said that she was Ruth Wolfberg. She was born in Berlin. And so when she came to America with an incorrect name and place of birth, I think she was concerned that she might be caught or sent back. And so she kept that name, just like my father changed his name. And both of them were fake. But she worked with the Bricha for 2 years. And then she came to the United States and met my father and married him and had a wonderful life. But what she says is it was hard work. 85% of the Jewish children in Europe perished. So you can imagine if they were not going to go and find these other Jewish children, a whole generation could have been lost. But oftentimes they would go, they would have to give money, large sums, and sometimes the people wanted to keep them to work on the farms, and they would just have to go and take them. And it was difficult work, but she just says we had to do it, and she was young and brave. And her family, for the most part, survived. And they were all in Siberia. The Jews that were able to get into Siberia, for the most part, survived. The ones that were in the Russian zone at the border from Poland to Russia that did not cross over were swept up and caught by the Nazis. But for the Jews who crossed over, if you refused citizenship, which they did because they wanted to leave when the war was over, were all arrested, and that's why they were sent to Siberia, because they refused citizenship. I think there were some other hands. Or she went to Israel a few times on the illegal ships. She would go and come back and go and come back. And it was when she was visiting her family in New York that she met my father, who was a young American soldier, and fell in love and decided to stay. And that's why I'm here.
When is your film due for release?
I'm sorry?
When is your film due for release?
So the film, thank you for asking. We expect it to be ready by the end of summer, and it will have to go through a process of film festivals. And then after film festivals, hopefully go to streaming. But we have to submit to film festivals. It's like applying to college. You have to apply everywhere, see where you're invited, and before then there's very strict regulations that it can't be shown until it goes into film festivals. But we will also bring it to Jewish film festivals, which I think is allowed. So very excited, incredibly talented filmmaker, animators, illustrators. I've completely put it in the hands, original soundtrack of this next generation. I haven't even seen what they're working on. I don't want to have an opinion because I think peer-to-peer, they're going to have a much more creative way to reach the next generation. There's one right over here.
So it's hard to have perspective, but it seems to me that the Holocaust denier universe is expanding. And I wonder what comments, obviously you're doing your role and your dad did, what comments you have on that.
That's a great question. I mean, I recently was a guest at the Senate confirmation hearing of Deborah Lipstadt, and I remember asking her, because she's now the U.S. envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, and was a big part of the Holocaust denial. And she said, if the Holocaust wasn't enough to end anti-Semitism, what will? And a lot of what Holocaust denial is, some is, are just distinct groups. Some are people who are using it because if they can say the Holocaust didn't happen, there's no reason for Israel to exist. But I always want to ask the deniers, like, if the Germans themselves don't deny the Holocaust as perpetrators, if they have a penal code that makes it criminal to have a swastika or do these things, why would people deny it on behalf of the people who perpetrated it, who are admitting it and chronicling it and preserving it? So I don't know how to explain that. I think it is just part of anti-Semitism, and it's just a part of people, practicing propaganda, spreading a message and believing it, even if it's not true.
Yes. When were you in grade school and high school, and what were you taught about the Holocaust in those years? And this was before you spoke, your parents divulged their story. So did it ever occur to you that you might be connected to this history? I don't know what you were taught and where you were in school, but what were you taught in school? Did any of it ever occur? Did you feel any connection to that? Or at that point, it just was a piece of history that is disconnected as the rest of it?
Well, I'm so old that when I grew up, there was no preschool. I think we stayed home till kindergarten. It wasn't taught in high school. When I was in college, there was a class called Nazi Germany that I took by Dr. Richard Breitman, who actually wrote a blurb for my new book. And I told him that my father had been in the camps, and he invited my father to come speak. And it was the first time I ever heard my father talk about the Holocaust. It was brief. It was very, I'm sure, traumatic for me. I think I was gripping my chair, trying not to fall out or run away. But I went to the Capitol Center in D.C. when the Holocaust Commission was formed, and Elie Wiesel was there, but it wasn't until the 90s that they had the U.S. Holocaust Museum, Schindler's List, so I didn't really learn about it until I was an adult and started reading books on my own. And as the museums, like the one here, they're also critically important, have risen up. That's where I got my education. But at that time, it wasn't taught in schools. I mean, now we have many states that have mandates. I've just actually was nominated and applied to be on the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Commission, working with Tennessee as well, trying to develop new ways to teach the Holocaust through art and other ways so that we can make sure these next generations and through the film learn the lessons. And that's the mission. One more. That's what the boss says.
Thank you so very much for telling this story. Could you comment about your understanding of the relationship between faith and God on the one hand and having to deal with suffering at this horrible extent of suffering that we're remembering today?
That's a really great question, and Rabbi could probably answer it. There's so many variations. I've heard some people who are extremely religious say that, God allowed it. I myself don't believe that. I said, as my father said, that God did not turn his back on humans, but humans turned their back on God when they chose evil. And I know that my father struggled with his faith, and one time he said, how could this be? My parents were good people, they didn't do anything, how is it that they died? That's all I prayed for. And I said, Dad, I can't answer that, but I can pretty much believe that as your parents were gassed, their last prayer was that you should live, and you did. So, I don't have the answers, I do have faith. There's been so many miracles and connections that have come out of this journey. It's got to be more than coincidence. I never claim to have the answers, and I can live with unanswered questions. So I do have faith, and I don't have an answer. I do know that what it does give us is a direction, which is to be more ethical, more compassionate, more fair, to respect and treat everyone, with the dignity they deserve, and to preserve life, and to fight hate. And one of the hostages somehow got on his phone during the crisis, and he put a message on Facebook that said, I'm being held hostage, I may not get out. Remember me and fight hate. And so that's my message, that we all have to do what we can. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Holocaust Center, I just want to say thank you for coming, and please take a look at the other programs that we have coming up throughout the year, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.